Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex. If you guys are anything like me, then you very well may love monster movies. Whether they are just flat-out horror or sci-fi, when it comes to speculative fiction, monster movies are some of my favorites. Even in fantasy, things like the Balrog in Lord of the Rings have always captured my fascination. I especially in horror trend towards these monster movies. They're somehow less upsetting, I think. I wasn't allowed to watch horror movies as a child, and so I am still getting into them as an adult. Most of the ones that I've gotten into so far have been monster movies, especially shark movies. You guys know I love sharks. But also giant snake movies, or one of my personal favorites, the crocodilians. So anything related to sharks or giant herptiles, I am really here for. I also minored in biology for my undergraduate degree. And in that time, I took a herpetology class as one of my requirements. And in that class, we had to trek through the forest, or really the swamps, both, honestly, at an ecology site in the South Carolina to Georgia area, and look for these creatures. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But that's largely why I have a huge fascination with reptiles, with herptiles in general, amphibians and reptiles. But I'm really interested in the satirical takes that sci-fi and horror tend to use in approaching the concept of the things that we see in the world around us. Honestly, that's just the fun of speculative fiction in general and why it has my heart. But as a scientist and an animal lover, I really enjoy especially these monster movies like Jaws or Deep Blue Sea or Anaconda. Or perhaps I ended up a scientist because I love these movies. Jaws was my favorite movie when I was 4 years old, along with Star Wars, Return of the Jedi, and RoboCop. So this is not really a surprise to me that I ended up in science. So now I really want to talk to you guys today about the concept of what a world in the future could look like in regards to reptiles if we do not get a handle on climate change. This is something that sprang to my mind after watching some videos on tuataras and sexual selection in herptiles, and I thought you guys might be interested as well. So, if you're sad about different animals going extinct right now, I also want you guys to consider the fact that many species rely on temperature-dependent sexual selection, and that those who are depending on that may lose their inability to find mates if climate change continues its trajectory. Remember that evolution typically takes millions of years to truly occur and to select for different genes that are more advantageous. Granted, the shorter the lifespan of the creature, the more quickly evolution tends to occur, as it's partly just a result of generational cycles, which is one reason why bacteria and viruses tend to evolve a lot more quickly than humans do. However, animals like reptiles and large fish like sharks do tend to live a very long time. And that is one reason why these excellent predators have remained relatively unchanged over millions of years. They are relics of the dinosaurs. Sharks, in fact, evolved before trees, which I think is pretty metal. And if you think that that's metal too, hit me up on Twitter. I would love to talk about the evolution of sharks and their ecological niches with you guys. But for right now, let's focus on the reptiles. So in the video I viewed on Tuataras, the host really informs us that 21 degrees Celsius is the sectioning point for male versus female Tuatara babies. And this means that eggs developing at a temperature under 21 degrees Celsius, or 69.8 degrees Fahrenheit, during the middle 1/3 of embryonic development will be female. Eggs that are exposed consistently to temperatures higher than 69.8 degrees Fahrenheit during that same period, the middle 1/3 of embryonic development, will be males. So that means that anything under a certain temperature is female, anything over is going to be male. And that temperature in the middle, that 21 degrees Celsius or that 69.8 degrees Fahrenheit, is your sectioning point. Scientists also often use sectioning points for a variety of different issues. In some studies within the realm of forensic anthropology, sectioning points are used for the weight of cremains. Those are cremated remains. Researchers in Florida and elsewhere have performed studies in which they have weighed the remains, and under a certain point, they are considered to be most probably female, and over a certain point, most probably male. And that is because sexual selection in humans tends to largely follow a male-centered slant. So males in general in humans are more likely to be taller and broader than females. And females, as we age, also tend to lose our bone density more easily than males, or more rapidly. So in this way, because that is partly associated with hormones, it tends to result in women having less body mass than men when it comes to our bones. Our skeletal frames tend to be smaller. And once you go into a retort, which is the machine that is used to cremate remains, you're being exposed to temperatures that are higher than 1100 degrees. A lot of these are going to be 1300, 1400 degrees. And that will help result in most of the flesh being cooked off and incinerated. And then what's left is the bones, which go through the calcination process, or the process of being burnt, really, until they get to the calcined appearance. So calcined bone is the type that looks very bright white in color, and that's the result of a bone being burnt at higher temperatures. They can get to the point of becoming cremains ash, although some portions of the human body, such as the petrous portion of the temporal bone and the teeth, often tend to still be at least partly intact, and sometimes those are pulverized in order to get them closer to the ashen consistency. Not because the people who work there think that it should be that way, but rather because some folks can become rather upset as they expect their loved ones to be completely ashes, and having certain body parts in there can be a little bit upsetting to individuals when they receive them. So since all of the fat and the meat components of the human body are burned off at that point, then all that's left when you get to the ashen component is really the bones. And that's why they're able to weigh them and create these sectioning points by having the known individuals who have died be weighed prior to being put into the retort, and then they weigh those cremains afterwards. Since you already know what size they were beforehand, then when you get them out afterwards, you can do things like compare how much is left over of the ash versus the original body weight, and check that out statistically in males versus females, or within the same sex, to check for any significant differences among that group. So you're checking between and among statistically to see what you're really getting, to see if there are any big statistical gaps, or if truly the bone density or the bone cremains weight tends to be pretty standard in males versus females. And you can check other demographics as well, including elements of the biological profile like age, stature, ancestry, sex, and so on. So now that we've covered the concept of sexual dimorphism, what that means for humans, we're going to talk a little bit about what that means for animals after this break. Stay tuned. You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco, ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were discussing the concept of sexual dimorphism, or differences in size between the sexes in humans, and a little bit as that relates to animals. It's really mostly an exploration in the sectioning point. having something of a measurement, whether that be temperature, with tuataras in the middle 1/3 of embryonic development dictating whether they are male versus female, or it be in weight in human cremains following being cremated. Sectioning points are very helpful in many different aspects of science, and also sexual dimorphism can tell us a lot about individuals and groups. So with humans, as we discussed, males tend to be larger in general than females do, although there are always outliers in pretty much any statistical sample if it is large enough. And that is okay. That's why we go ahead and make sure we have statistical groups that are large enough to filter through those discrepancies. And also, human variation and adaptation are dope, you guys. Let's celebrate diversity. There's tall women, there's really short men, and, then there's also me, who's very, very small. I'm a woman, so it's normally expected that I'll be small, but I am 5'2". So you guys, I'm pretty short, even for a lady. However, in sharks, females tend to be larger than the males. I have an entire diatribe written out about the song Baby Shark and why it bothers me, because everyone always makes the larger jaw motion for the male sharks, the grandpa shark, and the daddy shark. But in sharks, the sexual dimorphism trends more towards fat bottom girls, and I love them. These large female sharks, especially the great whites, do make this rockin' world go round. And I am so here for it. So technically, if you're singing Baby Shark, you should be doing the more expansive arm motions for grandma and for the mama shark than for the males. Otherwise, you are just assigning human principles to the sharks incorrectly. It's a very anthropocentric way to approach nursery rhymes by implying that the rules for human sexual dimorphism also apply to some of these sharks. Now that we know about sexual dimorphism and we know about sectioning points, let's continue to discuss sex determination of embryos. Determining it with that sectioning point of heat is referred to as temperature-dependent sex determination, or TSD. And it occurs in some fish and herptiles. So when we say herptiles, we mean amphibian and reptile species. Herpetology is the science of both of these, amphibians and reptiles. So sometimes we just call them herptiles in that field. And also, the word herpetology comes from, of course, ology means study of, and herpes, which is something that creeps or creeping. So herpes as an illness looks like a creeping pox, more or less. And if you think about different types of reptiles and amphibians, some of them do kind of seem to creep along the ground. So that's where the name comes from. Unless you are a creature that reproduces asexually through methods like binary fission, like bacteria do, fragmentation, like blackworms, budding, like hydras, parthenogenesis, like copperheads, or vegetative propagation, like strawberries, then you kind of need a male and a female in order to produce offspring. So in the example of the video I watched, the tuatara offspring pattern of females at lower temperatures in that middle 1/3 of embryonic development, and the males at the higher temperature at that same stage of embryonic development, tend to be referred to as pattern 1B of temperature-dependent sex determination, or TSD. So what that really means is with that sectioning point at 69.8 degrees Fahrenheit and females being produced below that temperature, if we continue with global warming beyond a certain point, we may lose a lot of female tuataras. There may not be as many females born, and thereby we may later lose tuataras in general. Because if you don't have the females, they're not going to be able to reproduce. If you're having trouble picturing the tuataras, they are a really cool reptile, pretty much little lizard guys is what they look like, and they are native to New Zealand. They resemble most lizards, but they're part of a distinct group referred to as Rhynchocephalia. And there is only one group of this species that is still alive. Rhynchocephalia is an order, and the species that is still alive or extant is referred to as the tuataras. Rhynchocephalia means beakheads, so that's kind of rude, but it is meant to classify them according essentially to what they look like. So the other members of this order are extinct. So if they're still alive, extant like the tuataras. If global warming continues and ruins their temperature-dependent sex selection, then even the tuataras may be extinct and thereby be the last species within their order to go extinct. So if you're sad about rhinos, then you may also be sad about these poor little beaky boys. Now, they're called beakheads, but they don't really look especially beaky to me. You're welcome to Google them though if you'd like to check them out. And I'll post a picture online too. Tuatara is spelled Tuatara. And they're really cool little guys. I think they're super cute. They also have a third eye. And their third eye has elements of regular eyes present, like a retina, a cornea, and nerve endings. Scientists think that they likely use this third eye to detect daily changes in light and seasonal changes. Remember, as herptiles, they are exothermic, so they need to be aware of these seasonal changes and these changes in light in order to also make sure they're properly thermoregulating. Also fascinating is that tuataras are cannibals, so they do eat members of their own species. Even if global warming does not get them, they may very well get each other. That third eye is visible on top of the head of hatchlings. It's called their parietal eye, and you also may recognize this term from taking a psychology class. You have parietal lobes, and you also have parietal bones. So the bones that form the top of your cranial vault, really the top of your head, are your parietal bones. Those are paired bones, one on the left, one on the right, that are above your temporal bones, behind your frontal bone, and above and in front of your occipital bone, the one that forms the base of your cranium, where it has the hole, the foramen magnum, which pretty much literally means big hole, through which your spinal cord attaches to your brain. So the top of where those parietals meet is where that third eye of the tuatara is located. And that's visible on the top of the head in hatchlings, but after about 4 to 6 months, it gets covered over with scales. They still retain the other elements of a regular eye though, like that retina, the cornea, and the nerve endings. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about some other types of temperature-dependent sexual determination. Stay tuned. You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were discussing the tuataras, what they are, where they live, their cool third eye, and their penchant for cannibalism, as well as the fact that they are type 1B TSD, or temperature-dependent sex determination. So during the middle 1/3 of embryonic development, if the temperature is below 69.8 degrees Fahrenheit, or 21 degrees Celsius, then the eggs turn out to hatch females. And if the temperature is higher than that, then they hatch as males. So that is pattern 1B. The inverse pattern, so you get males at the lower temperature and females at the higher temperature, is called pattern 1A. And that means that if global warming continued at the pace it has been, that eventually we may lose a lot of turtles. Because a lot of turtles are sexed in this way, or their sex is determined in this way. Technically, when we are typically referring to sexing an animal or sexing turtles or bones, we mean estimating or determining their sex based on the external genitalia or the markers on the skeleton that may indicate that. So, I just wanted to clarify that since I misspoke. For pattern 2, males are produced at intermediate temperatures, and females are produced at the extremes of either hot or cold, or, it's 69.8 degrees, really warm or cool, depending, I suppose, on where you live within the world. So that would mean that we would lose a lot of crocodilian males, a lot of lizard males, and a lot of turtle males. Also, some herptiles, like certain skinks and bearded dragons, have their sex usually determined by chromosomes, which is genotypic sex determination, or GSD, and it's very similar to how human sex is determined, but they can still be skewed by temperatures that are extreme but tolerable. And it's kind of like a temperature manual override in that way. It's also important to note that the temperature-dependent sectioning point between what will result in male versus female offspring does differ by species. So for the tuataras specifically, that 1B pattern is at 69.8 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 degrees Celsius. But for other types of animals, whether they be other lizards or crocodilians or turtles, so on and so forth, even if they are of that same 1B type, they may still have a very different sectioning point. But overall, my point is that if the globe continues to warm, we may lose a lot of species of the female variety, including the tuatara, and the males of certain crocodilian, turtle, and lizard species. My list is certainly not exhaustive, but these are the ones that I specifically looked into. But since both sexes are typically required to reproduce in these species, then losing one sex means eventually losing the entire species, unless we pull a Stargate or something and fill a ship full of the genetic material for starting over on a new terraformed world. And yes, I am talking about one of my favorite ones with the ethical concerns, Season 4, Episode 9, Scorched Earth. If you haven't seen it before, it's very needs of the many, outweighing the needs of the few, but also a determination of whom has the rights to property, the people who are already there, or those who are coming in with overwhelming forces and are largely trying to save their own people and their world. It's a really great episode, and you guys should watch it. But I digress. Back to the herptiles in what is perhaps about to become a satirical example of how far global warming may go. That's up for you to decide. My point is that a lot of species may ultimately become extinct because we often think of sex determination as being genotypic in nature because that's how our sex determination occurs. In humans, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, so 46 total chromosomes, and each of those pairs ends up being either an autosomal chromosome, the ones that aren't sex chromosomes. So you have 22 pairs of those autosomes, and then you have that final pair of sex chromosomes. And that one pair of sex chromosome will either be an XX in most cases and dictate that the individual is female, or an XY and make that individual a male. However, even in humans, sex is more varied than that, and there are numerous different types of issues that can arise and result in different types of intersex conditions. There's also some females who are born XY due to mutations in the Y chromosome, and there are some males who are XX due to a translocation of a tiny section of the sex-determining region of the Y chromosome. So your biological sex, your genetic sex, may be very different from what is presented in different situations. This is not an argument that there are multiple genders. This is a scientific fact that there are many different ways that sex may be determined and may present in the human body, both genotypically and phenotypically, how it looks in your genetics and how it presents on the outside. There are also other issues in which someone may be XXY or XYY or XXX, or they may only have a single chromosome, like just an X or just a Y. And these are referred to as being sex polysomies, or having more than 2 of those chromosomes for their sex component, or being a sex monosome or monosomies. So only having 1 single sex chromosome rather than having the 2 that you would normally expect. There are many different ways that this can come about, and a lot of different cultures that are outside of the United States also recognize greater gender diversity and sex diversity. So it's not always neatly divided everywhere in the world in this dialectical or binary oppositional dichotomy. It is instead viewed in many places as being a much larger spectrum. There are many different places in the world that take these things into account. For example, gender is generally thought of as masculinity and femininity, and it's a social construction that varies across different cultures and over time. So when I say it's typically described in terms of the scale of masculine to feminine, what I am really meaning is in Western cultures, especially within the United States. But there are numerous cultures in which there's a much greater gender diversity, and sex and gender are not always neatly aligned within these binary lines. It's not all male and female, or homosexual or heterosexual. There is a group in the Pacific referred to as the Fa'afafin that I read about in undergrad and again in graduate school for anthropology. And they have different gender categories that are much different from the traditional Western division of male versus female. Many Native American communities also recognize a continuum of sexuality and or gender rather than just being discrete categories. And there are also in many cultures special acknowledgments of folks who are, quote, two-spirited, unquote. So people who encompass both masculine and feminine qualities and characteristics. So we tend to think of gender and sex in a very Western perspective, but that perspective is, one, very limited, and it's also very American-centric or Eurocentric. We're truly broadly applying our basic understanding of this to our understanding of other individuals all across the world. And just as we are incorrect in doing so, as genetics has very well shown us, we also often tend to do this with animals. So when we think about how we reproduce, we also think of animals doing this in the same way. So for many folks, if they haven't majored in biology or they haven't taken classes in different types of animals, whether that be herpetology or zoology and so on and so forth, then they very well might not be aware that temperature-dependent sex determination even exists. And they may think that almost all of it is genotypic sex determination. So when we talk about climate change, a lot of times this doesn't even occur to anyone. So I think it's really important to bring up, both as a fun sci-fi experiment and also in the fact that this very well could be our future, as a lot of speculative fiction tends to point out. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about how some of these species may specifically die out. Stay tuned.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back Before the break, we were discussing how genotypic sex determination works in humans and how that is often a lot more broad of a subject than folks tend to think. We also talk about how people tend to apply a lot of Western concepts of gender and sex across the entire globe, when really it's more a Western perspective, and how similarly we think about what we know. And we also tend to think that most animals tend to have babies in a very similar manner to us, in which both a male and female are required and the sex is determined genetically, when often it is determined by temperature in very many species. So, as we were discussing, since both sexes are required for many creatures to reproduce, including in the cases of many temperature-dependent sex determination species, like the herptiles we're discussing today, the continuation of global warming may ultimately result in eventually losing many entire species. Now, I know that some of you may be thinking, great! I hate crocodilians. They're big, scary dinosaurs, and I hope global warming sends them all back to Hades. But you would be wrong, dear friend. You would be wrong. Anyone who is familiar with the dumping of large snakes, primarily, but not limited to Burmese pythons, into the Florida Everglades, can tell you that the American alligator is a natural predator in that area and is experiencing difficulty with the invasive snakes, and the introduction and subsequent propagation of those snakes is wreaking havoc on the entire ecosystem. The Burmese python and the American alligator are both apex predators who share the same food sources, including each other. It's not altogether uncommon for herptiles to be cannibalistic in nature. That means that these apex predators, they're at the top of the food chain, y'all. They are in direct competition with each other for many different resources. And size is generally the determinant of which creature is going to win in a gator versus python fight. Now, if you are like me and love those monster movies, you've probably watched Boa versus Python several times. I have it on DVD. But if you're not, you may not be familiar with these types of battles. You can Google it if you have the stomach for it and see the different outcomes of gators and pythons having these battles in the Florida Everglades. A lot of times it may result in the python being split open and the alligator bursting forth from its stomach, but the alligator has already suffocated by then or been constricted by then. And the snake, of course, has a giant gash in its stomach with half of an alligator hanging out of it, so it's also dead. Sometimes these things turn out to be a stalemate, but other times one or the other will truly win. This is a problem when it comes to the Everglades ecosystem. Right now, the gators still outnumber the pythons by a lot. But there are variables in play, like age to reproductive capacity, which is 4 to 5 years in the snakes, and 8 to 15 typically in the gators, depending on the time it takes each sex of gator to reach 6 feet, because they really become sexually mature at a certain size, 6 feet, and males tend to reach it sooner than females. This is also relevant to our discussion with the tuatara, because the tuataras tend to reach sexual maturity at the age of 15 to 20 years, but they can continue to reproduce even at the age of 100 years. And tuataras can survive more than 100 years in the wild. Climate change, however, may present future changes to the python to alligator ratio. So if you're curious, the average clutch size of eggs is about the same for each species, 35 to 37, although females of both species, Burmese python and alligator in America, may lay up to 100 per clutch. Female Burmese pythons and female alligators both mate about once every 1 to 2 years. The female gators protect their young for the first few years, while the female Burmese pythons stay with the nest for the about 2-month incubation period. Gator incubation is about that same length, and the Burmese pythons, though, ditch the babies upon hatching. In case you have these same questions about the tuataras, the males mate about every year, while females mate every 3 to 4 years, and the females lay 1 to 19 soft, leathery eggs about 8 to 9 months after copulating with the males, and then those eggs hatch after about 12 to 15 months. And that is the longest period of incubation in the world of reptiles as we know it today. Unlike the alligators and the Burmese pythons, the tuataras only get to be about a foot or 2 long, and they're only about 1 to 2 pounds. They're also significantly smaller than their herptile brethren. So the main predators of tuataras are foxes, cats, dogs, and stouts, whereas the main predators of Burmese pythons and alligators in the Everglades are humans and each other, and also themselves. Not the individuals, but the others of their own species, as we again have established that they are cannibalistic in nature. When it comes to hatching tuatara eggs, those babies are left on their own from the moment of birth. So much like the Burmese pythons, they are just ditched as soon as they hatch, and they're done. The moms are there to incubate, and then they are out. And the tuataras take a lot longer to reach sexual maturity, although they can continue reproducing up to age 100 years. That is, if a dog or a cat or a fox or some other creature does not eat them in the meantime. They're not big dudes, and their main sources of food are beetles, crickets, spiders, frogs, lizards, eggs, and birds. So with these different creatures, we're going to go back to the alligators real quick. Alligators are especially important to the Everglades because they're what we call ecosystem engineers. That means that they alter their habitats and they maintain the environment that they live in. Tuataras, on the other hand, tend to just go ahead and reuse the burrows of seabirds. Sometimes they will dig their own burrows, but they like the old burrows of seabirds because the feces produced by the birds tends to attract insects and other types of invertebrates that are a primary source of food for the tuataras. So they're capable of creating their own burrows, but they don't tend to. Whereas the American alligator is a natural inhabitant of the Everglades, and they alter those habitats and maintain them. You may have heard of alligator holes, and they're the holes that gators dig mud out of in the limestone bedrock beneath the water with their snouts and their feet. And those holes then fill with water, which is retained even when the marsh water levels deplete during very warm weather, because they're underground. They're away from places where they can just evaporate easily. They are kind of insulated from the external temperatures as well. And that can be really important for other animals in that ecosystem. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about that importance of ecosystem engineers and how alligators specifically help the others around them. Stay tuned.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
the break, we were talking about differences in reproduction between the Burmese pythons and the American alligator in the Florida Everglades. Remember that the Burmese pythons are not native to the United States, and they are instead a form of exotic pet that has been imported to the area, and folks tend to buy them thinking these snakes are super cute, which they can be, but they can also grow to be quite large. Some people tend to become overwhelmed by the large size of the snake, or they decide to make life changes related to getting different types of pets or having children and things like that. And there are just many different factors that go into a person's decision to dump these snakes. The ethical thing to do is to appropriately surrender them to an area that will house and protect these snakes. But a lot of folks just dump them into the Everglades. They just go, hey, there's a lot of giant reptiles out here. What's one more snake? Unfortunately, there are so many of them out there now that it's starting to outcompete the alligators in some ways. There are still more alligators than snakes right now, but these are a very dangerous predator to add into that ecosystem. And just dumping them out there is bad news bears. It's not just bad news bears though, it's also kind of cruel. You never want to dump any animal that has been in a domestic situation out into the wild. And that means even snakes in this situation. Dumping snakes into the Everglades when they've lived their whole lives in a terrarium and have been just dropped mice in there is really rude, even if they kill the mice themselves. And that's because they're not having to seek out and hunt these mice. Sure, there's a solid likelihood they could figure it out maybe out in the wild, but you're really setting them up for failure unless they're already pretty ginormous before you put them out there. And then if you do that, then that's a big safety issue for other creatures, including folks who may happen to be fishing or doing other things that are a part of the day of life that is associated with living in the Everglades area. So guys, in general, don't dump tame animals loose in the wild. It's sad when you watch it as Homeward Bound or The Incredible Journey, or you read those books with the fluffy animals, but it's also sad when you do it to the cute scaly ones. So make sure that they are going into the appropriate ecosystems, and that if they are from a totally different ecosystem, that you're not just dumping them into another, that you're appropriately surrendering them. And if they've been tamed or domesticated at all, that you do surrender those. A lot of wildlife centers, wildlife rehabilitation centers, and nature centers will go ahead and accept those. My mom works with a lot of large birds like bald eagles and other types of eagles in Florida that people have surrendered or who have been injured and have been placed at the sanctuary because they can't survive on their own in the wild. And that is something that she and other people like her are very passionate about. And when I was growing up, we would take animals to the nature center all the time. Possums and a turtle that got hit by a lawnmower, a bird that flew into a windshield. Just constant trips to the nature center. And they were always stoked to see us because they were happy that somebody cared enough to give these animals their best shot. So whether your friends are furry or scaled, please do give them their best shot and take them to an appropriate place for care and release. And remember, if they've been domesticated, the wild is not an appropriate place for you to release them. They need to be rehabilitated by a professional who can make that final determination. But the snakes aside for the time being, back to the alligators, our little ecosystem engineers. And I like to think of them as wearing little yellow hard hats when we call them ecosystem engineers, just because it's cute and it's funny. Don't at me. Or do, whatever. We have a Twitter, you guys, so let me know how you feel about that. Anyway, they are ecosystem engineers. They maintain and they modify their environment. And these holes that they dig are really important homes and resources for food, shelter, and water during the drier seasons for other marsh animals. They help maintain that entire ecosystem, not just by eating creatures and keeping those populations in check so disease doesn't run rampant, but also by providing them with food, shelter, and water. It's not that they're technically doing it on purpose with the intention of helping these species, but rather that that's just a natural byproduct of who they are or what they are. And I think that that is really cool. A lot of people look at gators and just think that they're scary, but they play a really important part in their ecosystem. And a significant reduction in alligators will thereby reduce those holes. And regardless of the reason, that can cause an ecological cascade effect. So paralleling that is also research that supports the hypothesis that Burmese pythons are largely to blame for the vast reduction in small and larger animal sightings like the Florida panther in the Everglades. Although environmental change may also shoulder a portion of that blame. That potential combo is just really bad news bears for an entire ecosystem. This is larger than just the world getting a little bit warmer. It's larger than just alligators and pythons duking it out in the Everglades as well. This has far-reaching ramifications. It really is potentially a cascade effect. Much like how a knee injury really brings the importance of that previously unconsidered joint's role in daily functioning into stark relief, ecological issues are also too often not realized until humans are smack dab in the middle of them at a crisis event. And that's really important to think about. Humans in general tend to only care about that which is immediately impacting them, or even intermediately impacting them, but impacting them on a personal level. So we've let a lot of things slide over the years as individuals and as humanity in general, until we've gotten to the point where there are some visible differences in how the world looks while we've been quarantined for a couple of months. Granted, it's not, putting dolphins back in certain places, and it's not necessarily turning these streams entirely clean, but it is resulting in some types of change. Reductions in smog and things like that as fewer people drive to work. And in this way, it's very similar to other types of environmental change. And when we think about this, even though these Burmese pythons are largely to blame for the vast reduction in small and larger animal sightings in the Everglades, and they're saying that environmental change may also shoulder that blame, we're also largely responsible for that environmental change. And who dumped the Burmese pythons in the Everglades to begin with? So humans are really causing these problems, but then we're not really paying attention to what's going on with them until we're right at crisis level, because a lot of these things are happening on an individual basis. We're not considering as individuals how much time we're spending in our cars or creating any of these environmental issues, or even as individuals, I'm putting one snake in there, it'll be fine. Well, yeah, you as one person are putting one snake in there, but there are also hundreds of other people who are also putting one snake in there, and those snakes will breed and then create even more baby snakes. And in that way, our impact as individuals and as a species also can create an ecological cascade effect. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to wrap up how all of these variables come together and discuss my final points. Stay tuned.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were discussing how the ecological cascade effects can occur regarding human behavior, the Burmese python behavior, and even alligator behavior, or the interactions of these species together. And we also likened it to a knee injury. We don't really think about our knee structure and function until we get an injury there. Now I am speaking from my own specific experience. I've got a bum knee, y'all, and I didn't really think much about my knees until I injured one, and I was only about 26, I think, at the time. And then after that, I thought a lot about my knees, and I think a lot about them now with my daily functioning. Kneeling, squatting, lunging, everything is a lot more difficult when you have a bum knee. You have to modify your workout routines and everything. And that's what the environment's like. We don't realize what roles these different creatures, these different organisms play until things have gone totally sideways. So in this particular instance with the Burmese pythons and the alligators, with the Everglades and reproduction and climate change, if all of the snakes reproduce via genotypic sex determination, like humans do, and many of these crocodilians reproduce via temperature-dependent sex determination pattern 2, like the alligators do, where the males are produced at intermediate temperatures and the females are produced at either extremes of hot or cold, or warm or cool, then at a certain point, we may end up with a dwindling population of only female alligators, left to combat the unchecked population growth of giant invasive snakes that are in an ecosystem they do not belong in and would not be in if humans hadn't dumped them there to begin with. Additionally, several research studies in snakes over the years have found that as the climate warms, the areas that the snakes thrive in will also expand. And that's because climate is a major factor in controlling the spread of ecotherms, like snakes. So the difference between great whites and these crocodilians and other ecotherms like these snakes regarding their locations is partly how they obtain their heat. So with the crocodilians and many types of herptiles, including these snakes, they get their heat from the environment. They thermoregulate via their environment. So they need that exposure to sun. They need to know about these seasonal changes, like the tuatara sense with their third eye, their parietal eye, so that they can tell when they need to hibernate as well. White sharks, on the other hand, are a type of shark called lamnid sharks, and they have a very unique system called a counter-current heat exchange. And that works to keep their body warmer than the outside conditions by about 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. So if a white shark is in 9 degrees Celsius water, its body temperature is actually going to be about 19 to 24 degrees Celsius, and so on. So that's a really basic way to put it, but technically, these great white sharks have an endothermic process, whereas these herptiles are getting their heat ecothermically or exothermically from outside of their body, from their ecosystem. So that makes a big difference, and that's why great white sharks can be found in the waters off the coast of Australia or Florida or California or even way farther north. And you can check out the migration of these sharks as well as many types of crocodilians by going to the OCEARCH website. That's OCEARCH.org. It's pretty cool, and you can also see all of the quirky names that scientists have given to these animals. Now, they also track whales and seals and stuff like that, but I'm mostly interested in the crocodilians and the great white sharks. And, some other sharks too. But the great whites I'm very fascinated by because they have some really big ones. I think Luna is like 12 to 15 feet. I want to say she's 15 feet, but I'm not quite sure. She was off the coast of the North Carolina area a while back. So they have some really cool data that you can check out there too and see where they're moving around. But my point is that the range for these creatures is a lot more broad with these great white sharks that have endothermic processes rather than these animals like the snakes and crocodilians that are ecotherms. They have to thermoregulate using the ecological system around them. So some of these creatures are going to hibernate in the winter. They're going to burrow underground. Some of them are going to choose different outlets. It just depends. They might just chill in Florida, not go much further up past South Carolina or so, typically. It just really depends on the species and on the individuals and their circumstances. But as of 2009, research experiments conducted by herpetologist and conservationist Dr. Michael Dorcas indicated that many of these snakes can survive the winter outdoors as far north as central North Carolina's Savannah River Ecological Laboratory in Aiken. So I did my herpetology weekend field trip survey there when I was an undergraduate, and we were out for over 12 hours per day just searching through the swamps for all kinds of animals, cottonmouths, alligators, anything, you name it. We looked for carpenter frogs. We were trying to tell where they were and find them by the sounds of the noises they made, and also check in their natural environment for things that they would enjoy. Like sometimes they'll place some sheets of metal out there so that it will attract the snakes and stuff to want to be underneath there and to get some more heat in that manner from their environment. So I've been to this specific ecological laboratory, and they have some really cool creatures that live there. But this is also where Dr. Dorcas performed this study. And while many of these snakes die during particularly harsh winters, the ones that survive by using the burrows of other animals or by staying coiled up in terrestrial brush piles get to pass on those cold hardy genes to offspring that may then be able to thrive in colder environments than their predecessors, or at least be able to survive. So my points are as follows. If we don't start caring about global warming, we are going to have to start crazy Burmese python roundups in the Everglades, like we do here in Texas with those rattlesnake roundups, because the alligators aren't going to be around to help us out with it. Admittedly, it may take decades or more to get to that point, and granted, evolution may also surprise us, but evolution normally takes a very long time to come about, especially when you're not able to hit that sexual maturity until you are in your tweens or so, like the alligators are. The ecosystem may also hyperbolically implode. Giant snakes versus alligator monster movies will end up being a nostalgic sci-fi possibility of the past, as they have rotated through becoming an actual reality, and then there not really being any more alligators to fight these snakes. And of course, this is and will be all of our fault. Both the giant snake problem and global warming as those snakes also begin encroaching into areas that are now warmer than they used to be, and those areas may continue to warm and expand the territory of these snakes until we have rampant giant snakes in areas we are not prepared for. So my final thought is, do you want rampant giant snakes? Because that's how you get rampant giant snakes. Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please subscribe to the show, and writing a nice review always really helps us. Also, if you could please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I'd appreciate it. Thank you kindly, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.